I will tell you, when I was asked to do this, and again, as I said, I was flattered. It's an honor for me. When I was asked to do this, it was a few months ago, and I told Father Andrew, after just, I think it was about 3 days in the same week in his morning mass, I had the foundation, and it was all from Matthew. And that's why in the materials I've included a couple of gospel readings, and I'm not going to read them because again I would be intimidated. But there are some lessons from the gospel that really it's not a herniated reach to apply them to discipline and discharge, certainly in the Catholic workplace, but really in any workplace. Progressive discipline, and again, that's what Jesus was essentially saying. And I hope that doesn't sound sacrilegious, but it really was. And then equal application of the rules, and exercising patience. And I know that there's probably a few folks in here who would say 77 times. That's nothing. That's at least once a month, 77 times a month. But anyway, so those are food for thought. I really do believe that those, like the real golden rule, not the one we talk about in the courtroom, it really, and then the first and greatest of the commandments, it really, again, because we're looking at 8 people who, when it gets right down to it, are looking at a decision that you make in the workplace to determine if it was quote-unquote right or quote-unquote fair. And before I get into some of my suggestions, I want to talk about those 8 people. Because again, if you've had to deal with me, and if you think sometimes I can be overly cautious, let me explain why. When I started this, I've been trying cases for over 30 years. And depending upon where, and we used to try a lot of cases when I was young. Now I average about 2 a year, which is more than virtually any lawyer around. Maybe I'm disagreeable, I guess, but except for those that do divorce and criminal work. But in the sort of the civil cases that I handle, a lot of the lawyers I run up against, a lot of those that I work with, have never tried a case. And it's real important, because when they ultimately have to try a case, then they wish they had tried more. Anyway, over the course, I tried a case last month. It was a difficult case. It was a disability discrimination case. The plaintiff in the case was a registered nurse, and she had epilepsy. And she basically said that the employer in that case terminated her because she had epilepsy, which in itself, that's a damning allegation. And if any of you have ever served on a jury or even been on a jury panel, you have, especially in state court, in federal court they limit it, but in state court we have a lot of time to ask jurors a lot of questions to determine whether, frankly, we want them on our jury or not. Lawyers, if you've done it, lawyers say, oh, we just want a fair jury. That's not the case. I want a jury that's going to hold my way. And we can't admit that, but that's what we want. So as I was looking at this panel, it's about 4 weeks ago now, in Polk County, I thought, I may have said I'm getting old, but I thought, the city and our society has changed. It used to be, and I'd always ask sometimes wacky questions. I always ask about, do you have a bumper sticker? Have you ever written a letter to the editor? And people wonder why, so I can determine what their values are. And I ask questions like, what is the most important value you teach a young person? If someone were to give you $10,000 and tell you can't keep it, you need to give it to a charity. I ask those questions because my my psychology, my jury experts tell me what some of those things mean as to how people think, and then I can extrapolate and determine whether I want them passing judgment on my client's conduct. But I looked around, and when I first started doing this, the jurors were very diverse in Iowa. They were either German or Norwegian, or I'll call them Des Moines mongrels like me, and they were either Catholic or they were Lutheran, and if depending on where you were down south, you had Methodist or the unchurched. I first heard that word a long time ago from Monsignor Beeson, unchurched, and I've heard it many times since then. But my jury panel in Polk County, there was an Iranian immigrant, there was a woman in a hijab, there was a woman who had 7 children and 12 grandchildren, and she was in a same-sex marriage. I asked, there was one person on that jury, and there was 18 people we were questioning, one person who had any connection to the military. Now, how many of them had experience with being mistreated in the workplace? All of them. They all either knew somebody or thought that they themselves had been mistreated in the workplace. How many of them had dealt with, it was a disability discrimination case, so how many of them had dealt with perceived discrimination based on disability in the workplace? 16 of 18. A lot of them, there were millennials, and without even asking them questions, I know some things that millennials think, and because we've done a bunch of research on it, because they're going to be my jurors for the next 10 years, and then they'll still be around. I won't be. They are extremely self-centered and self-focused because of technology and because of society, but they expect everyone else to do the right thing, and the right thing is what they think you ought to do. 60% of them think that it is acceptable if you disagree with the message you are hearing. 60% of the millennials in college today believe that it would be appropriate to stand up and shout them down and to interfere with their ability to give that message. And that's why you're seeing that happen at our college campuses. So, I tell you that, and by the way, we can't ask in Iowa, you can't ask someone if they go to church. Our Constitution has the same protections that I discussed in the federal Constitution, but we also have extra protections. A lot of people forget about these, but in the Constitution, in the very first chapter of the Iowa Constitution, you cannot use a religious test to serve as a juror. What does that mean? That means that trial lawyers cannot ask jurors about their religious beliefs. So what does that mean? We come up with 100 ways to get at that information without asking about it. Are you active in any organizations? Have you had a leadership role in any organizations, civic, charitable, or otherwise? So I want to find the Knights of Columbus, okay? But a lot of times they'll volunteer information. And my assessment, again, I can't ask, but my assessment of those 18 potential jurors, I think there were 2 that identified themselves as being affiliated with what I'll call mainstream religion. There was one that was Catholic, and I knew that because she was going to be my ringer, but the other side figured it out, and it's because I knew she was Catholic because I knew her. Even though she forgot she knew me. I think she was honest in that too. Anyway, the reason I tell you that is when I talk about, let's talk about how we do this and do it right, that's why. Because we have 8 people, and you know what? They don't really care if you're the Catholic Church. They don't care if you are an institution like Principal Financial that adds value to the community that's been here for a long time. They don't care. And so it's somewhat frightening And I've been to, over the years, I've been to trial. I was trying to think of the number of trials that I've had for the Catholic Church or Catholic entities, and who I've been to trial with. And some of you are here, and we've had some. I can't imagine. Monsignor Hess isn't here, is he? He's the only person I've ever met that actually enjoyed it, I think. and he was good to have as a client and witness. It was a case where someone stepped in a hole at Dowling after some work had been done, and she broke an ankle. She was there for a basketball game, and she brought suit. And we defended it, and then Monsignor Hess took the stand, and he was being cross-examined about lighting at Dowling Catholic High School, which is Dowling back then. And somehow he got in, despite all the admonitions I'd given him just to answer the questions. He got in that, yes, we'd actually had complaints from the neighbors at Dowling because our lights are too bright. And this was a basketball game, and she claimed that there was inadequate lighting. We won that one. Anyway, those days are gone, all right? Jurors are skeptical, and they're skeptical. The collar doesn't mean much for our jurors now. And the fact that you've dedicated yourselves to a Catholic school, to Catholic education, to any, and I'm not picking on us, on Catholics. That doesn't mean much to them anymore. They all buy into conspiracy theories. They think that if there's a victim, that victim should receive redress. Now there's still some ways you can get by, but fairness is extremely important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because of the people who are passing judgment on us in the civil courts now. So what I wanted to do was just talk about discipline and discharge and the lessons that we get. All right, first of all, progressive discipline. I think that you have what I'll call a standard form. And I want to talk a little bit about some things that should be in the standard form. And I'm inviting Eileen and anyone else here to correct me or to... You've got the sample? Okay. Yeah, okay. If there's anything, though, that if I've strayed, let me know. And the one thing that I get to in this context is, if you ask me a really tough question, like, for example, how would the church react to this, and it doesn't involve really me applying the law, I can say, that's above my pay grade, and there's someone here who can make that decision for you. So, with regard to this, though, let me go back to the case, the disability discrimination case. She has epilepsy. She had worked for my client as a case reviewer. So my client in this case, this is all public record. Once you get in the courtroom, it's public. I don't tell tales. It's unprofessional to disclose anything, even anonymously, about a client. So this client decided to go to trial because it didn't think it had done anything wrong. It thought she did not perform, and we're going to go defend our name. And we won. So we got a defense verdict. They were only out half an hour, which was rare. But in this case, though, she alleged the reason you terminated me was because I have epilepsy. I had a seizure in the workplace, and you knew I had seizures. Well, the exhibits, I was going to bring one, but I decided not to, but she, in the 2 years that she worked there, when she was given, literally, she had to meet a goal, and that goal was just the minimum, but the minimum happened to be 98%. She had to review 22 cases in a day, and everyone else in the workplace had to do it, and if she didn't do it, they had to cover for her, okay? And the other side put up a timeline that showed that she started work, and just shy of 2 years after she started, 2 months, she was told, you are going to be terminated if you don't meet this goal. And then 2 months later, she was terminated. And because she had had a lawyer working with her for about a year before she was let go, in those 2 months, what she did was she kept coming back and saying, I think if you were to provide me with a different desk, it would help me. I think I need a different computer screen. I think the lights need to be adjusted. I think if you were to allow me to not take calls after 3 o'clock, I think if you could allow me to only review mental health cases, these would all help me. And the employer responded to every single one of those tennis volleys and said, we can do that, and we'll do it. What they did say is, we can't turn the phone off for you after 3 o'clock because that will impose on your coworkers. And we can't just give you one type of case to review because that will impose on your coworkers. And otherwise, the employer did everything. So that was that timeline. Well, our timeline was, she had been given 5 final written warnings starting a year before she was terminated. On her 1-year anniversary, she was given a final written warning because she wasn't meeting the production standard. And I call them 5 final written warnings, but it was an amended final written warning. And that was documented like only a company that reviews documentation can do. It was 7 pages and they did a great job of doing some of the things that we're going to talk about here. And that is, they outlined the conduct that was below expectations. On each one of these 5 instances, they would do it just by cutting and pasting from the document before. Remember, in May, we told you X, and we told you would have 60 days to improve your production. Now, 60 days later, you have not improved your production. So, we are reminding you, here's the production goal. They did that 5 different times over the course of 12 months, after 1 year of employment until the final decision to terminate. And you think, wow. Well, that's why the jury was only out for about half an hour. But essentially, that's kind of what you have to do. And I know, looking around, some of you actually do more than that. But that's what's expected. And that's why the process, it may seem like you're emphasizing process, but it's important. It's important for that reason, because you're going to be second guessed. And so I'm going to give you a few I call them just common sense rules that I've learned over the years. Mostly from seeing how things go wrong in the courtroom. Okay. One of them is, if it's not in writing, it did not happen. Jurors believe this, even though they may be in a workplace where they don't get written warnings. If somebody is working, I do a lot of work for Deere. Deere doesn't provide written. If you're sending a tractor off the line and it's defective, because you didn't meet the production goals, they don't go to someone who's protected by the UAW, by the way, and say, here's a written warning for you. But those people who work on that line expect that your workplace would have written warnings because they've been told that. So, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And I will tell you, disappointingly, very often, even if you recall that, on June 12th, I remember sitting down with you and telling you, you've done this, and you have to stop doing this. For example, once again, we told you that our workday starts at 8:45. You're rolling in at 9 o'clock, and it's real important because we've got parishioners or students here. You really have to be here. and you haven't come in at 8:45 for the last month. And I know that because I've been here, or because someone else has been here. And even if that employee says, yeah, I know, I have a really hard time, I'm trying, I'll do better. By the time you get to trial, and I've just changed the setting to make it a Catholic setting, but I've had that very set of facts. And that employee said, I don't remember you ever telling me that. So you have to, and again, I'm not suggesting to you that the people that you're dealing with are like this, but there are a lot of people, when they become plaintiffs, they are uncoupled to the truth. And part of that is there's actually a phenomenon that it's plaintiff's syndrome, where they actually do forget certain things that are inconsistent with what they believe is their just cause. I mean, I've got some, surely I deal with liars all the time, but there are some that literally the professionals say, yeah, we've got an explanation for that they can forget that. Well, they can't forget it if it's in writing. And that's why it's important to have written records of performance.
How about somebody sends an email?
Email, perfect. Great question. What about an email? Is an email in writing? You bet. An email is in writing. How many of you regularly use email, like in the workplace? Okay. Email's a double-edged sword. Because it's good to talk about this right now, Father. One of the other rules that I have here is think before you push. And let me just say what happens when I get one of these cases. The first thing that happens is after we do an initial dance of sort, then we do discovery. And what that means is the other side asks for every document, which is defined on 6 pages, to include emails, every document that mentions Joe Smith. So if you have an email that's saved, and I guarantee you we could talk about email, even if you think they're gone, they're probably there, unless you really know how to eliminate them. And an expert can find them, or we have to find them. And if it's something that you wish you hadn't said in hindsight, think of it being blown up that size, because that's what happens to them. Do any of you, does anyone have any problem with the concept? And I know sometimes it seems offensive, but does anyone have any problem with the concept that you really need to reduce to writing performance issues that you're dealing with? Have any of you ever had that go wrong? Okay, I've run into, and again, this would be, I've run into some folks who've said, I'm not going to do that because that literally, it's undignified. I'm not going to quote unquote make book on somebody. I'm not going to keep book on somebody. I've communicated to them, I don't lie. I expect them not to lie. It's there. And if there's anyone that has that philosophy, great, except most jurors don't have that philosophy, and they really don't understand it. And that's why I always talk about writing. Yes?
Well, I have a question. How important in the documentation is the employee's signature? Like, what if they're unwilling to accept your account of events? Something.
Great question. I will. So the question is, how important is the employee's signature? You've got a checklist, you've got some form documents. And what I say is, it's not important. Okay? What you need to do though is, if you've had either it's productive or unproductive meeting with an employee, and you've given them in writing the problems that have been outlined, you've shown them, we'll go through it here in a minute. If they refuse to sign it, you simply write on there, refuse to sign, date it, and you sign it. And surprisingly, most employees when confronted with that, aren't going to say, oh, I never saw that. I've never had that happen. Most jurors aren't going to say that didn't happen. Now, what they'll say is, oh, that employee was angry, or he or she thought this was fundamentally unfair, etc., but you have to deal with that anyway. So I do not believe that it's important. You can't force them to sign it anyway. So as long as you simply note that they refuse to sign, you're okay. So a few things before we get to the fundamentals. Another of the sort of axioms are, again, like, you've heard it before, but no good deed goes unpunished. Again, if you're being diplomatic, if you're being too kind, if you're someone who tends to avoid conflict, that will come back to haunt you. You're better off dealing with it right up front. Concept, what notice? A lot of times, even if you've been writing, the employee will say, I never really knew. Okay, I see these notes here, but I never really knew what the problem was. So make sure that your documentation explains, don't dance around what the problem is. You outline, here's what we require of you, here's what you've done, you're not meeting our expectations. It's that simple. And as long as you use polite, professional, not profane language, juries don't take issue with that. Okay? If you truly adhere to the progressive discipline doctrine, all right, here's another one of my axioms, we'll skip that. Changing of the guard. It is a fact of life that in certain workplaces that we're dealing with here, every so often there's a new boss. And it's because there's been movement. And I have the same thing, I'm going to leave the Catholic workplace for a while. I have the same thing in regular for-profit entities. You get a new manager. Well, how many times I've had this? New manager comes in, I get a case, and this new manager was discriminating against this individual. And we know it because within 6 months of being assigned to supervise this individual, they had written this person up 4 times for things that had never been documented before. Well, they'd never been documented before because the old manager didn't do it. They should have. So when I say the changing of the guard, if I ever suggest to you, great, let's be a little bit more patient, and it's because of that. Did you hear, any of you hear about the $4 million verdict that was issued over in Powesheik County about a month and a half ago? $4 million. 38-year employee, had cancer, ran the pharmacy of a hospital, was terminated. And he was terminated because every single doctor there said, he's incompetent. He just can't do this job. They said, we've been very patient with him. Never had a single bad evaluation in 38 years. Not even before they were terminating him. So, what happened though, new CEO says, I can't put up with this. It's endangering our patients, it's enraging our doctors, you're out. Jury concluded that new CEO had to be discriminated on the basis of age and or disability. We have to deal with, especially those of you who have younger employees, they don't understand the power of a lot of the technology they use. And by that I mean they know how to use it and they know what it can do, but what they don't understand is the dark side of it. And that is, I've had a number of cases. We just had a termination in a public school in rural Iowa, and it was because a teacher on Facebook was friends with a number of her students, she was a sponsor of an extracurricular activity, and she was engaging in the sort of back and forth that the students engage in and using the sort of language that they do, talking about another of the students. And that student found out about it because, of course, people share these things. So technology is great, but maybe not. So let me just talk about a quick discipline checklist, and then what I'd like to do is if you have any examples or any questions, what I want to do is see if we can just work through them, okay? But, pardon? Yeah, you can, yeah. So, and again, there's nothing magical about this, but over the years I've come up with just certain suggestions for the sort of things that should allow you sort of a recipe, if you will, for doing these things. First of all, let me talk about the worst case scenario, and that is the discharge checklist. If you are making a decision as to whether or not somebody should be discharged, think about these things. Is the decision based on facts? That is it based on facts as opposed to inferences or stereotypes or rumors? Now again, I'm not telling you to discount something just because you didn't see it happen. People understand that it is reasonable for someone in your position to rely upon credible sources of information. But the proviso there is make sure it's a credible source of information. Some of you know if you've got long-standing feuds, either in the workplace or in the church or in the community, in a family, just make sure that you are considering the source and you're basing it on facts, things that we can prove. Is the dismissal consistent with your past practice? In a vacuum, something may seem like a no-brainer. In the healthcare setting, somebody slapped a child. The child was biting this individual. They slapped the child. That should warrant termination, right? Well, I agree. Unless the evidence is that 6 other nurses over the course of the last 5 years have had to slap, defend themselves with biting children, and they were given final written warnings. Then all of a sudden this stands out. Is it consistent with what has happened in the past? And again, if you've had turnover, if you don't know what's happened in the past because it's not in writing, make an effort to try and find out. What would 8 people think of your decision? Okay, that's literally the litmus test I use. Would it seem fair to 8 reasonable people? And then as far as the way you carry out the dismissal, I've got some suggestions on that too. Human dignity is the key. As Bishop Pates mentioned earlier, you know, your workplace, you're held to higher standards. There are a lot of places I deal with where even professionals, when it's determined that they are going to be let go, they're walked out and their stuff is boxed up for them and sent to them, or they're walked back to their office or their cubicle with a security guard, and they're allowed to box up their things. Why do they do that? I don't know. When I get the questions in advance, I always advise against that approach. There are legal reasons to not do it that way. But mostly I hear that they want to make sure that that individual cannot do harm. That is, that individual cannot disrupt the workplace. That's the phrase I hear all the time. Well, we were worried that he was going to disrupt the workplace. If you're strategic about making that decision and delivering that decision, that doesn't have to be a problem. And likewise, one thing you can do to make sure is limit the potential harm they can do. And most of the harm that can be done now is electronic. So if you just limit their ability to do electronic harm, that should serve any need that you have with regard to timing or nature of the termination. So the document itself, confidentiality is extremely important. And even though it may or may not be a separate claim or cause of action, if something is not kept confidential, it lends a bad taste to the entire process. And it causes a juror, and the evidence will come in. We can try and keep it out, but the evidence comes in. It causes jurors to wonder, well, this whole thing seems tainted. They didn't do this in a professional way. Can you, in your documentation, can you point to the rule or standard that wasn't followed? And you should be able to do it in a sentence by referencing something. And if you can't, think about it. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with having as an expectation the ability to get along and to be professional with others. A lot of folks think, well, that's not part of the job. It is part of the job, especially in your workplaces. That's an essential function of the job, and if they don't do it, you can take action. If there are exhibits, I call them, if they're witnesses or documents that you take into account, identify them. Identify them in your documentation. Circle back. If you have told someone about this problem before, remind them. When you tell them again, remind them, we told you about this in January. It may seem overly simplistic, but when it's blown up very large, I guarantee you'll be glad that it was done that way. If you have unrealistic goals, if someone has been with you for 10 years, or they've been with an entity for 10 years, and you come in and you think, this person should have been fired 5 years ago, but I know Hardy said we've got to do this. So, all right, I'm going to give you 2 weeks, and you're going to change, and if not, you're fired. Juries don't like that. They know what you're doing. They know, and they won't see it as you being impatient or righting a wrong that someone else didn't. They'll see it as you perhaps discriminating or treating someone unfairly. Statement of the consequences. Make sure that you outline, again, it may seem sort of axiomatic, but outline for the individual what could happen. And it seems ominous, it may seem cruel, but outline for them the consequences of failure to change or improve. I think that's the last of the rules that I've come up with over the years. If you have any questions, now's the time. I'll take any question you have. If not, I'll just leave it. Yeah, Jason.
2 questions. One would be when you, just say you go through everything as it should be by the book, the person that eventually goes their separate way, they're saying all sorts of things, right?
Assume that they're saying things that are untrue. They're saying, or they're expressing their suspicions. How do you react to it? I suggest you ignore it, unless I think I'm chewing batteries. I suggest you ignore it unless unless someone is being defamed, and you have to defend, not really yourself. If it's aimed at you, I would ignore it, because you'll be able to defend yourself if you were the decision maker. If they're calling into question the motives or the performance of others, you can, and I would suggest, by the way, you do this with assistance. You can send the message that they really should stop this. Because, again, jurors understand the concept of defending the survivors, if you will, defending the remaining workforce. They don't like someone who is at the top of at the apex, who does the "how dare you"? They don't like. So I always suggest that if it's aimed at you, which 9 times out of 10 it is, just ignore it. Do you have another one?
Yeah, and then so,
Great question. So the question is, you've got a bad apple who is gone, and they're going to land somewhere else, and boy, you really hope they get that job, because then it reduces the risk that they're going to sue you, right? But what do you do? What I suggest, thanks, Father, I'll be done by the time you get that in. What I suggest you do, and again, this may seem officious, but we have a policy that you do not provide references unless you've got a release saying that you can do so. And most employers will be able to provide you with that. If you don't have that, I suggest you simply, and this will really sound overly formal for this workplace, but I really think that you should say, it's our policy to tell you the title and the dates of employment. Here's what it is. And unless you provide me with a signed release from this individual authorizing me to give you a frank and complete reference, I'm going to only give you the dates of employment and the title held. So, Father proved me wrong again. Thanks, Father. And if you don't have that release, if you look in the materials I provided, not only do you have defamation, what would happen is, if you give a reference and you say, this individual was terrible, you're engaging in what's called per se defamation. And that is, you're harming them in their profession, which means they didn't even have to prove that they were harmed. That's defamatory. Now, you got a great defense. Truth is a defense to the defamation claim. But who wants to go to the court and prove that it's true? Especially if you've avoided the lawsuit, you don't want to buy a new lawsuit by providing a frank reference without getting a release. Then also, if you look in the materials, we have a blacklisting law in Iowa, and it's 730.1. It was passed back in it's an old law. It was passed to keep railroads from blacklisting union organizers, essentially. But it has been applied to anyone who might have a reason to keep someone from getting a job, and that's especially true if there's some connection in the workplace. We get that a lot in healthcare. If there's a healthcare chain, again, that's why all you have to do is get a release. And that is, I authorize full, frank reference. I release from any claim. And you should be able to get that from most prospective employers. And there's no such thing outside of the confessional. There's no such thing as just between me and you in any workplace. And I get that, it comes up a lot. Oh, I didn't know that they would tell them. So if you get those unofficial, I know you're only going to give me the name and the dates of employment and the title held, but can you give me a little bit more than that? As soon as you do that, I've had that come out in the courtroom. It's embarrassing. So in closing, in preparation for your panel, I have one last football story. When I went to Iowa in 1978, I was Bob Cummings' last recruiting class. And if anyone's an Iowa fan, that usually brings up chuckles but because Hayden Fry came right after that season. And Bob Cummings he actually recruited the guys that went on to be the first Rose Bowl team at Iowa for years. He was not a real good coach. For example, we were 2-9. And that was par for the course. But Bob Cummings was well liked, and he was a motivator. And I remember my very first home game. We're in the bowels of Old Kinnick, and he had the place rocking. We were getting ready to play that first game at home, which happened to be Iowa State. And he had us rocking, and he had the starters whipped up into a frenzy. And he turned to us. We were over, the freshmen were all together. They used to suit us up, I think, just to keep us out of trouble. But he turned to us, and I thought, here it is. He's going to give us our separate speech about the future of the Iowa Hawkeyes. And he was beet red because he used to chew tobacco and smoke at the same time while preparing for a game. And he turned to us, he said, "Men, stay out of the way." And yeah, that stuck with me. And that's the advice that I give anyone who's serving in your capacity. Just try and stay out of the way. Stay out of the courtroom.